Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we will be retelling the story of Illidan Stormrage. Illidan was a night elf sorcerer, a prisoner, and eventually something that Azeroth had no easy name for. His story spans 10,000 years. It moves through the rise and fall of civilizations, through wars that reshaped the world, and through the life of a single person who was at the center of more of it than anyone fully recognized until it was nearly too late. It is not a story that resolves cleanly. It does not end with a simple verdict, but it is one of the most complete and most costly lives in all of Warcraft's long history, and it is worth taking the time to tell properly. If you can, please leave a comment with where in the world you are listening from. Drop a like if you enjoy these, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future stories. Now, let's dive into the story so you can get some rest. The world was different then. There was a single great continent called Kalimdor, and at its center there was a lake unlike anything else on the surface of the world. The Night Elves called it the Well of Eternity. It was not an ordinary body of water. It was a reservoir of pure arcane energy, vast and ancient, older than the civilization that had grown up around it. Its origins were cosmic, a remnant of the Titan shaping of the world, left behind when the Titans departed. And in the millennia since, the Night Elves had built everything around it. Their cities rose along its shores. Their magic was drawn from it. Their social hierarchy, their culture, their shared sense of who they were, all of it organized around the light the well cast and the power it offered. It had been this way for so long that most Night Elves did not think of it as a choice. The well was simply there, the way mountains are simply there. And the civilization that had grown up around it was large and sophisticated and genuinely impressive, full of great cities and art and scholarship, and the particular confidence of a culture that has been successful for a very long time. At the top of that civilization sat a queen named Azshara. She was by most accounts extraordinarily gifted, among the most magically powerful individuals the Night Elf people had ever produced. She was also deeply, genuinely certain about the rightness of her own judgment. She believed that her civilization was the highest expression of what life on Azeroth was capable of. She believed that the well was a kind of destiny, pointing towards something even greater than what already existed. And that certainty, more than any particular decision she made, is what opened the door to what came next. The Burning Legion had been searching for Azeroth for a long time. Sargeras, the fallen titan who commanded it, understood what the Well of Eternity represented. He had consumed worlds organized around similar concentrations of magical energy before. The well was exactly what he had been looking for. His agents found Azshara and made her an offer. She found their offer compelling, and between her certainty and their patience, something was set in motion that could not be easily stopped. A portal opened deep inside the Queen's palace. Through it, something vast and ancient began to pour into the world. The war that followed was unlike anything the Night Elf civilization had prepared for, because the civilization had never truly prepared for war at all. It had been at peace for so long, protected by its magic and its isolation, that the idea of an existential threat had drifted far beyond the edge of what anyone seriously considered. And then it was not at the edge, it was at the center. And everything the civilization had assumed about itself began to come apart. In one of the cities near the well's shores, two brothers had grown up who would both leave marks on the world that are still felt today, though in very different ways, and for very different reasons. Their names were Malfurion and Illidan. They were twins. They had shared the same beginning and arrived at very different places. Malfurion had found his way to Druidism through a connection with Sargeras, a being older than most of the cities they lived near, who saw in the younger Stormrage twin a receptivity to natural magic that was rare even among those who sought it. Druidism was not a prestigious path in Night Elf civilization at that time. It was considered old-fashioned, a little outside the mainstream of what a gifted young Night Elf was supposed to want. Malfurion chose it anyway. He was drawn by something in the connection itself that felt more true to him than the alternatives. Illidan had gone in a different direction, toward the arcane, toward the raw power the well produced, toward the kind of magic his civilization valued most, and that he had a genuine and exceptional talent for. He worked hard at it. He pushed past the limits that most practitioners accepted. He became something genuinely rare, a person who could do things that almost no one else could do. The drive behind this was real, and it was not simple. It was partly the satisfaction of mastery, the feeling of expanding what was possible, and partly something harder to name, a hunger that the mastery fed without ever quite satisfying. Malfurion worked with the resistance. He brought what his druidic training had given him and operated as part of something larger than himself. He had come to understand the war through the lens of what Sargeras had taught him as a consequence of an over-reliance on the well, a vulnerability that had been building for centuries without anyone noticing. He understood what the solution would need to be. He understood what it would cost, and he moved toward it steadily. Illidan moved differently, less as a member of something, more as a person following his own judgment about what the situation required. He gathered intelligence and took real risks. He developed a picture of the enemy that few others had access to. He also made choices that were harder to explain to the people around him, choices that seemed from the outside, like something other than what he believed they were. The distance between his understanding of those choices and everyone else's understanding of them is one of the things the story of Illidan keeps returning to across all the long years that followed. Malfurion had understood for some time that stopping the Legion meant destroying the well. Not just closing the portal, destroying the thing that had made the portal possible in the first place. The well was the wound. As long as it remained a vulnerability, a point of entry for anything vast enough and patient enough to find it again. Closing the portal would buy time. Destroying the well would mean something more permanent, at a cost that was also more permanent. The well had been the center of Night Elf civilization for as long as civilization had existed. Destroying it meant destroying the foundation of everything the culture had built. The cities, the magic, the shared sense of what they were. It meant asking an entire people to begin again, without the thing that had defined them, in a world that had just survived the worst thing that had ever happened to it. Malfurion knew all of this. He did it anyway. The explosion released when the well was destroyed tore the continent apart. The single landmass of Kalimdor split into several pieces, separated by a new ocean that rushed in to fill the basin where the well had been. The destruction spread outward in every direction, earthquakes and floods, and the collapse of the great cities along the shores. By the time it was over, a very large portion of the Night Elf population was gone. The world that remained bore only a passing resemblance to the one that had existed that morning. The survivors found themselves at the edges of a remade world. The well was gone. The cities were gone. The civilization organized around both of them was gone. What remained were people and memory and the slow work of figuring out how to build something livable from the pieces of something that had been magnificent and was now underwater. For many of those survivors, the loss was total in a way that did not diminish with time. It simply became the central fact around which the rest of life was organized. Illidan was not willing to let the well go entirely. Before the final moments of the war, he had taken several vials of water from the Well of Eternity and kept them. After the Sundering, when the immediate chaos had settled into the longer, quieter chaos of survival, he carried those vials to the peak of what would become Mount Hyjal and poured them into a mountain lake. The new well he created was smaller than the original. It had to be made from a handful of vials rather than whatever cosmic process had produced the first one, but it was the same thing in essence. The same concentrated arcane energy, the same nature, the same potential. He had preserved what Malfurion had spent everything to destroy. And he had done it deliberately. When Malfurion found out, the confrontation between them was not a conversation that ended well. The imprisonment that followed was the result of a judgment that did not have room for complexity. The post-Sundering world was fragile. The survivors were still accounting for what they had lost, still trying to establish something stable on the far side of the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And into that fragility, Illidan had introduced a new well, smaller than the original, but carrying the same essential nature, the same potential for the same kinds of disasters. From Malfurion's perspective, the choice was clear. From Illidan's perspective, the choice was wrong. Neither of them was entirely right. And there was no process available to either of them for resolving that kind of disagreement that did not end in one of them being removed from the situation. Maiev Shadowsong was given responsibility for Illidan's containment. She was a warden whose dedication to her duty was total and whose feelings toward her charge were not warm. The cell was sealed beneath Mount Hyjal, the guards were set, and the world moved on without him. 10,000 years passed. The Night Elf civilization rebuilt itself into something quieter and more careful. The druids practiced their slow magic. The priestesses maintained their order. The forests grew back, gradually over the centuries, and underneath all of it, in the dark beneath the mountain, Illidan remained where Malfurion had put him, with the darkness and the silence. And whatever 10,000 years of that produces in a mind that had never been entirely at peace to begin with. 10,000 years is a span of time that resists easy comprehension. It is longer than recorded human history. It is longer than most of the great civilizations of the real world lasted from their founding to their collapse. The Night Elves who lived in Kalimdor at the time of Illidan's release were not the Night Elves who had imprisoned him. They were their descendants, separated from the War of the Ancients by the same gulf of time that separates modern people from the earliest human civilizations. What they knew of Illidan was not memory but legend. The cautionary story of a powerful sorcerer who had preserved the thing his brother had destroyed and paid for it with everything. Maiev Shadowsong had not changed in the ways that mattered. She had spent the full 10,000 years maintaining the responsibility she had been given, rotating the guard schedules, maintaining the seals, keeping watch over a prisoner who had not spoken to anyone in the full span of her tenure. What that tenure meant for her, what organizing an entire life around a single act of containment produces in a person over centuries, is not something the records address directly. What is recorded is that when the order came to release Illidan, she opposed it, and that her opposition was overruled. He was free. The world was ending again, and what he was going to do about both of those facts remained, for the moment, an open question. The Burning Legion's return in the Third War was organized around a specific objective. The demon lord Archimonde intended to consume the power of the World Tree. Nordrassil, the great tree planted atop Mount Hyjal above the new well, infused with blessings from the dragon aspects to limit the well's power and protect it from further corruption. The plan was well advanced by the time Illidan entered the picture. Stopping it required the kind of desperate coalition that only existential threats produce. Humans and orcs and night elves fighting alongside each other against something that would have consumed all of them with equal indifference. Illidan's contribution took a form that said everything about who he was. He did not integrate into the coalition's command structure. He did not subordinate his judgment to the collective strategy. He found the skull of Gul'dan, an artifact of immense demonic power, the crystallized essence of one of the most powerful warlocks who had ever lived, and he consumed it. The act was extraordinary. The consequences were immediate. The demonic energy in the skull transformed him physically, giving him wings and horns and a physical power that went far beyond what he had possessed before. He was more powerful. He was also more demon than he had been, in ways that were visible and permanent. The people around him received this with exactly the alarm that such a transformation tends to generate. His justification was tactical. The power was necessary. The threat was real, and he had used what was available to address it. This was not an empty argument. The power he gained was genuinely useful in the war's final stages, but the act was also consistent with a pattern that had been present since the beginning, the willingness to absorb costs that others would not absorb, to use means that others would not use, in pursuit of ends that he believed were correct. This pattern would define the rest of his life. Sometimes it would look like heroism, sometimes it would look like something harder to defend. It was almost never simple. The transformation Illidan underwent when he consumed the skull of Gul'dan was not merely physical. The wings and the horns and the burning fell eyes were the surface of something deeper. He had taken demonic essence into himself deliberately. He had known what it would do. He had calculated that the power it provided was worth the alteration it required. Whether he fully understood what that alteration would mean across the decades that followed is a question the record does not cleanly answer. What he gained was real. The power the skull provided was enormous. In the final battles of the Third War it mattered, and he used it with the specific effectiveness that had always characterized his best moments. Clear-eyed about the tactical situation, unsentimental about the costs, willing to commit completely to an approach once he had decided it was correct. He turned the tide of specific engagements. He contributed to an outcome that without him might have been different. What he lost was harder to quantify. The demonic essence he had absorbed was not a tool he could set down when the war was over. It was part of him now, woven into his physiology and his power in a way that required constant management, a hunger for more demonic energy that he had to actively restrain, a pull toward the darkness that the transformation had introduced into who he was. He had made himself partially into the thing he was fighting, not as a betrayal of his purpose, but as an expression of it. The logic was not irrational. It was, in fact, the same logic that would eventually produce the entire order of demon hunters he would one day train. But in the short term, it made him something that Azeroth did not have a comfortable place for. Malfurion's response to what Illidan had done was not simple, because nothing between them ever was. He was not wrong to be concerned. The changes in his brother were real, the risks they represented were real, but he was also looking at Illidan through the weight of 10,000 years of separation and through the lens of the judgment he had made at the beginning of that separation. That lens did not make it easy to see his brother's choices in their full complexity. The confrontation that followed the Third War produced Illidan's exile from Night Elf lands. It was defensible as a security measure. It was also, in the context of everything that had come before it, one more verdict rendered against a person who had never quite managed to be understood by the people whose understanding mattered most to him. The exile placed Illidan in a position that was genuinely precarious. He had consumed the skull of Gul'dan. He had transformed himself into something that carried the mark of demonic power permanently. He had been exiled from his people for the second time in his long life, and into that position Kil'jaeden arrived with an offer. Kil'jaeden was among the most powerful of the Burning Legion's commanders. He was methodical in a way that distinguished him from the more straightforwardly destructive members of his kind. He had been responsible for the corruption of the Orcs and the creation of the Lich King. He had spent millennia working toward the Legion's goals with patience and precision, and he understood Illidan's situation clearly, the isolation, the exile, the hunger for purpose that had been a constant throughout Illidan's long life. He approached him with what appeared to be a straightforward transaction: destroy the Lich King, who had become a complication for the Legion's plans. In exchange, receive the power and resources and standing that success would provide. Illidan accepted. The reasons are not entirely opaque. He had been exiled. He had been transformed into something his own people feared. He had been told in the clearest possible terms that there was no place for him in the world that had been rebuilt over the 10,000 years of his imprisonment. Kil'jaeden was offering a direction, a purpose, a use for capabilities that kept being treated as a problem rather than an asset. The bargain was dangerous, and he understood it was dangerous. He made it anyway, which is, again, entirely consistent with who he had always been. What Kil'jaeden actually wanted was the destruction of the Frozen Throne, the crystal structure in Northrend that housed the Lich King's power. The Lich King had begun showing signs of independence from the Legion's control, which was not something the Legion found acceptable. Eliminating the Frozen Throne would eliminate that independence along with everything it contained. Illidan gathered the forces available to him, Blood Elves under Prince Kael'thas and Naga under Lady Vash, neither of whom was a natural ally, but both of whom had their own reasons for working with him, and moved toward Northrend. The assault on Northrend was a serious military operation conducted across hostile terrain against the defenses of the undead Scourge, with forces that had no common origin and no shared institutional culture. Illidan managed it with the competence that his long life of combat had produced. Not perfectly, but effectively enough that the forces under his command reached their objective, pushed through the defenses, and arrived at the Frozen Throne itself. What happened there is one of the defining moments in Illidan's story. He was there to destroy the throne. He had the capability to destroy it. And before he could complete the act, Arthas arrived. The Death Knight, who had murdered his own father and delivered Lord Aeron to the Scourge, had been racing to Northrend for his own reasons that had nothing to do with Illidan or the Legion or any of the larger stakes that had brought Illidan to that place. The fight between them was genuine. Its outcome was also genuine. Arthas defeated Illidan, left him for dead in the snow outside the Frozen Throne, and went inside to merge with the Lich King. The defeat was the second major military failure of Illidan's life. And like the first, it came with survival into a position worse than the one before it. Kil'jaeden's reaction to the failure was not forgiving. The Legion did not extend second chances in any meaningful sense. Illidan had failed a powerful and dangerous patron, and now had to face what that failure meant. He withdrew with the forces that remained to him and began looking for an alternative, a position from which he could operate without being subject to the Legion's judgment, and without being subject to Azeroth's judgment either. Both had been rendered. Neither had been favorable. He found what he was looking for in Outland. Outland was what remained of a world called Draenor, after it had been torn apart by reckless portal magic. What survived was a collection of floating land masses in the twisting Nether, connected by precarious bridges and ancient infrastructure, still inhabited by the remnants of populations that had survived the destruction, but no longer a coherent world in any conventional sense. By any reasonable assessment, it was a terrible place. Dangerous, resource-poor, populated by factions that had been fighting each other across the ruins for years. It was also, from Illidan's perspective, a place that no one else particularly wanted. It had no authority structure that he needed to negotiate with or displace. And it contained, in the form of the Black Temple, exactly the kind of physical base of operations that his situation required. The Black Temple had once been a Naaru holy site before being converted to other purposes. Magtheridon, a pit lord, had been ruling Outland with the brute dominance that pit lords favored. Illidan defeated him, imprisoned him beneath the temple, secured the fortress, and took Outland for himself. It was the first time in his long life that he had something that resembled a home on his own terms, a place from which he could operate according to his own judgment, building something without the oversight of people who had already decided what he was. What he built there, in the years between the Third War and the events that would eventually bring Azeroth's heroes to his door, was something that looked from the outside like an empire. A ruler, a military force, a territory, a set of rules governing the populations within it. From the inside, it was something more purposeful than that. He understood that the Burning Legion was not finished with Azeroth. He understood that the defenses he was building in Outland were not merely for his own protection, but for a purpose that went beyond it. He was preparing for the Legion's return. He was training Demon Hunter's warriors who underwent the same transformation he had undergone, blinding themselves and absorbing demonic essence, becoming partially what they fought in order to fight it more effectively. He was building something that he believed Azeroth would eventually need. Whether anyone would understand this before they came to kill him was a question that the years in the Black Temple did not answer in his favor. The forces Illidan assembled in Outland were not a conventional army. They were a coalition of the displaced groups and individuals who had their own reasons for operating outside the structures of Azeroth's established powers, and who had found in Illidan's project something that served their particular needs, even when those needs were not entirely aligned with his. The Blood Elves arrived through Prince Kael'das, heir to the High Elven throne. The High Elves had been devastated by the Third War. Arthas' assault on Quel'Thalas had destroyed the Sunwell, the magical font that had sustained High Elven civilization for millennia. The loss was not simply one of power. The Sunwell had been the center of everything for the High Elves in the same way the Well of Eternity had been the center of everything for the Night Elves. Its destruction produced in the surviving population something that resembled addiction in the clinical sense. Their bodies had developed a dependence on the Sunwell's energy across generations of proximity. The craving was real. The suffering it produced was real. And there was no easy answer to it. They renamed themselves Blood Elves in mourning for their dead. The name was a deliberate signal these were not the same people who had lived in Quel'Thalas before the assault. The destruction had produced something new. Kael'thas led them with the intense focus of a person whose entire world has been destroyed and who has organized the remainder of his existence around preventing it from happening again. When he brought his people into Illidan's service, he was making the least bad choice available from a position of genuine desperation. Illidan offered access to Fel energy, which could address the withdrawal the Sunwell's loss had produced. Kael'thas understood what Fel energy was and what using it would mean. He accepted the terms anyway, because the alternative was watching his people suffer with no resolution in sight. Lady Vash and the Naga brought a different kind of alliance, one with older roots and a more personal character. The Naga were the transformed descendants of the Highborn who had been in Azshara's court when the Sundering happened. They had not died in the Cataclysm. They had been pulled beneath the ocean and reshaped by the old god N'Zoth into the serpentine forms they now occupied. They retained the intelligence and the arcane capability of their ancestors. They had spent 10,000 years in the depths developing a civilization that no one on the surface fully understood. And Vash's loyalty to Illidan was personal in a way that the Blood Elves arrangement was not. She had served Azshara's court in the ancient world. She had known Illidan before the war. Whatever that connection meant to her across 10,000 years of transformation and isolation, it was real enough that when the opportunity to serve him arose, she took it without hesitation, and she remained loyal to him through circumstances that gave other members of his coalition reasons to reconsider. Together, these forces, the demon hunters training in the temple's deeper chambers, the Blood Elves, the Naga, and the various other groups that had found their way to Outland, constituted something that had never existed in quite this form. An organization built specifically around the purpose of fighting the Burning Legion from the inside, using the Legion's own nature against it, led by a person who had made himself partially demonic not out of corruption, but out of a calculated assessment of what the fight required. The mission was real. The sacrifices it required were real. And the fundamental problem was that from the outside, from the perspective of Azeroth's heroes who would eventually arrive in Outland, none of this was visible. What they saw was a warlord holding territory with an army of monsters. The distinction between that appearance and the reality underneath it was one that the events of the Burning Crusade never quite managed to resolve in Illidan's favor. Maiev's Shadowsong had not stopped being a warden when Illidan left Azeroth. The release Tyrande had forced over her objection was not, in Maiev's understanding of herself, a conclusion. It was an interruption, a disruption of a responsibility she had not been given permission to set down and was not prepared to abandon. She had spent 10,000 years organizing herself around a single task. When that task was removed by someone else's decision, she responded the way people do when a purpose that has defined them is suddenly taken away. She doubled down. The hunt that followed was a years-long operation conducted across multiple continents and eventually across the dimensional boundary into Outland itself. It required Maiev to develop capabilities and gather alliances that her original mandate as a prison warden had not specifically prepared her for. She was good at it. The qualities that had made her effective at containment, the patience, the thoroughness, the refusal to be distracted by considerations not directly relevant to the objective, were the same qualities that made her effective at tracking a target across terrain that most of her contemporaries had never visited. She did not find the work overwhelming. She found it purposeful. And for Maiev, purpose was a condition more comfortable than almost anything else. The moral texture of the hunt is worth examining carefully because it is one of the places where the story of Illidan most clearly illustrates the dangers of certainty. Maiev was not wrong that Illidan had done things that by the standards of Night Elf law warranted a response. The second, the choices during the Third War, the transformation via the skull of Gul'dan, all of these were real. The case for accountability was not manufactured. But Maiev was also a person whose relationship to accountability had long since collapsed into something simpler and more personal. The sense that Illidan's containment was not merely a legal obligation but a moral mission, that the universe would be better ordered with him imprisoned or dead, that the pursuit of that outcome was self-evidently justified by the outcome itself. This kind of certainty does not leave much room for complexity. And over the years of the hunt, it produced a person who was in many respects as consumed by a single purpose as Illidan was by his. The difference being that Illidan's purpose was pointed at the Legion, while Maiev's was pointed at Illidan. Her coordination with Akama against Illidan brought her into contact with someone whose reasons for opposing him were different from her own, and more specifically grounded in actual lived experience. Akama was one of the broken Draenei, the diminished descendants of Draenei who had been exposed to fell energy in the long years following Draenor's destruction. His service to Illidan in the Black Temple was not chosen. Illidan had taken a fragment of Akama's soul as insurance against defection, and Akama served because the alternative was worse. He waited because patience was the only tool available to him, and he watched for the moment when the arrival of outside forces would shift the balance enough to make a different choice possible. The relationship between Maiev and Akama was a collaboration between two people whose reasons for opposing Illidan were genuine and also quite different. One driven by a personal mission that had outgrown its institutional justification, the other driven by the specific and immediate desire to recover what had been taken from him and to free his people from an arrangement they had not chosen. That their collaboration eventually produced the result it did is not a simple vindication of either of them. The outcome also killed someone who had been doing something genuinely important and whose death left work undone in ways that would only become apparent later. This is the particular difficulty of situations where people on different sides of a conflict are each partly right. The Black Temple had originally been a place of genuine sanctity. A temple dedicated to the Naru, built by the Draenei when they first arrived on Draenor as a center of worship and communal life. It had stood for thousands of years as one of the more significant religious sites on that world. Its conversion into Illidan's fortress was therefore not simply the occupation of a conveniently located structure. It was the overwriting of one meaning with another. Whether that overwriting was deliberate commentary on Illidan's part, or merely pragmatic use of what was available, is a question the record does not cleanly answer. The temple was massive. Multiple levels, each organized around different functions and populated by different factions of the force Illidan had assembled. The upper levels handled the administrative and military functions of running a fortress that was also a seat of power. The deeper chambers were where the demon hunters trained, where the transformation Illidan had pioneered was passed on to the next generation of people who had chosen to undergo it. The structure the Naru had built for the purpose of approaching the light had become, through the full weight of the history that had happened to it, the place where people learned to become partially what they were fighting. The fighting moved through the temple level by level, each floor stripped away until what remained was the final room and the final confrontation and the person at the center of everything that had led to this moment. Akama's betrayal came when it was designed to come. The fragment of his soul recovered, the silent alliance with Maiev made visible at last. It was not a sudden reversal. It was the culmination of a patience that had been building through the full years of his service, executed with the precision of someone who had spent a very long time waiting for exactly this moment. Maiev stood over Illidan at the end and said the thing that 10,000 years of the hunt had been building toward. The words she chose contained an irony she may not have intended. In declaring that he was finished, she was also describing herself the warden whose entire existence had been organized around this moment, who now had nothing left to warden. The hunt was over. The prisoner was dead, or appeared to be. His body was taken. The demon hunters scattered. The coalition dispersed, and the Black Temple stood in the silence that followed, massive and patient, carrying in its stones the layered histories of everything it had been before Illidan found it, and everything it had been under his tenure, waiting to become something else again. The years between the fall of the Black Temple and the events of the Legion expansion were years in which Illidan was absent from the world in the most complete sense. Not imprisoned this time, not sealed in a cell beneath a mountain with guards and wards and the slow passage of centuries. Dead, or close enough to dead, that the distinction did not seem to matter to most of the people who had known him. He was not in the world. He was not making decisions or training demon hunters or holding fragments of souls as leverage. He was gone. And the world continued in his absence the way worlds continue after the removal of significant figures, partly unchanged and partly different, because the specific gaps left by specific people are real and not always filled by whatever comes next. The demon hunters he had trained continued to exist in that world, scattered, without central leadership, defined by the transformation they had undergone and by the mission that transformation had been built to serve. They were not a comfortable presence in Azeroth's established order. The changes they had made to themselves were visible and permanent. The bound eyes, the horns, the demonic markings, the physical alterations that years of training had produced. The world around them had no established category for what they were. They were not demons, though they carried demonic power. They were not ordinary warriors, though they fought with extraordinary effectiveness. They belonged to neither side of the line they had been trained to hold, and the people who encountered them responded with everything from suspicion to hostility to occasional grudging respect. What they maintained, through the years of Illidan's absence, was the training he had given them and the mission it had been built around. They continued to hunt demons because that was what they had been made to do, and because the demons did not stop existing simply because their creator had died. They operated in the margins of the world's conflicts, dealing with threats that conventional forces either did not notice or were not specifically equipped to address. Some of them struggled with the demonic hunger the transformation had introduced, the pull toward the darkness they were supposed to contain, the management problem that Illidan had faced since the Skull of Gul'dan, and that was harder to maintain without his guidance or the structure of the Black Temple community around them. The ones who managed it well kept doing the work. The ones who did not became cautionary examples of what happened when the balance shifted in the wrong direction. The debate about what Illidan had been and what he had actually done continued without him. The absence of the person makes it easier to argue about what the person meant, because the living tend to complicate the narratives built about them simply by continuing to act. The case against him was made frequently and with genuine justification. The collaboration with the Burning Legion, even if undertaken under duress and with ulterior motives, was a real collaboration. The subjugation of Akhama's people was real. The methods of governance in Outland had produced real harm to people who had not had meaningful choices about whether to be governed that way. The case for him was made less frequently and in more qualified terms. He had fought the Legion before the Legion's return was widely acknowledged as imminent. He had built the Demon Hunters, who were in the long run one of the more effective weapons against demonic forces Azeroth had ever produced. He had disrupted the Legion's operations in ways that cost them time and capability that the eventual defense of Azeroth would benefit from, without credit and largely without acknowledgement. He had done all of this in isolation, in the place that no one else wanted, under conditions that included being dead for a significant portion of the relevant period. The evaluation of what this amounted to is not a question the historical record resolves, because it is a question that resists resolution by design. What is clear is that the world did not stop needing what he had been building toward. The Legion's patience was longer than most of the institutions defending against it, and its next assault was already in preparation during the years when Illidan was absent and Azeroth was doing what it usually did between catastrophes, rebuilding, arguing, and gradually losing the alertness that the memory of the last crisis had produced. The demon hunters who survived the fall of the Black Temple were eventually captured and imprisoned in a facility called the Vault of the Wardens. The wardens who ran the facility were the institutional descendants of Maiev's order. The fact that Illidan's demon hunters ended up in a warden facility is the kind of detail that the history of this story keeps producing, not quite irony and not quite justice, but something shaped by the specific ways that institutions perpetuate their own logic across generations. The imprisonment was not the same as the one Illidan had experienced. The demon hunters were held together, which meant they maintained the community and the discipline he had built into them. They continued their training under conditions that were constrained but not entirely eliminating. They were waiting the way they had been trained to wait, alert, prepared, certain that the moment would arrive when what they had become would be needed, and uncertain only about when that moment was. The Legion's assault, when it came in full, was that moment. The opening of the tomb of Sargeras brought the Legion's forces pouring into Azeroth in the numbers they had been assembling for years. The demon hunters had been built to respond to exactly this, and responding required releasing them from the vault into a world that had not resolved its feelings about what they were. The release was not a reconciliation. It was a deployment. The recognition, forced by necessity, that their specific capabilities were relevant to the specific threat that had arrived, and that excluding those capabilities from the defense of the world was a luxury the situation did not permit. They were released into the fight as people who had been told they were dangerous, and were now being asked to be dangerous on behalf of the people who had said it. The distinction between those two things was not lost on them. What they brought with them was everything Illidan had given them. The training, the transformation, the ability to see and engage with demonic forces in ways that warriors without their specific alterations could not. They also brought the institutional memory of what he had built, the practices and the disciplines and the philosophical framework that distinguished a demon hunter from simply a very powerful fighter with demonic powers. Illidan had understood that the transformation was only as valuable as the structure surrounding it, that the demonic hunger, left without discipline, would consume the person who had absorbed it, that the structure was the difference between a weapon and a catastrophe. His demon hunters carried that structure with them through the years of imprisonment and brought it to bear in the fight that had always been the reason for it. The twisting Nether is the chaotic space between worlds, the realm through which demons travel, and the medium through which the Burning Legion maintains its organizational coherence across cosmic distances. It is not a place designed for habitation. The chaos of it is not merely environmental, it is fundamental, organized only to the degree that the Legion's imposed structure provides organization, and the beings that move through it carry their own coherence against a background that is actively working to dissolve it. Illidan persisted in the Nether after his death at the Black Temple. The power he had accumulated across his life was sufficient to maintain some form of continued existence in a space that consumed less resilient beings without difficulty. What exactly that existence looked like, what it felt like to be Illidan in the twisting Nether across the years of his absence from the physical world, is not something the records describe with any precision, because there was no one present to witness it. What is known is that he was there, and that he was not idle. He fought the Legion in the only arena still available to him. He gathered intelligence about their plans and their preparations. He did this without allies, without resources, without the institutional structure of the Black Temple to support him, in conditions that were by any measure worse than anything he had faced during the most difficult periods of his physical life. The years in the Nether were not a waiting period. They were the continuation of the same work, in the hardest possible setting, by a person for whom stopping was apparently not a viable option, regardless of what the circumstances were. What those years produced in him is harder to assess. He was changed by the Nether in the ways that extreme experiences change people. The version of him that returned to the physical world was not identical to the one that had fallen in the Black Temple's innermost chamber. He returned with a clarity about the Legion's ultimate objectives that could only have come from direct engagement in the space where the Legion organized itself. He also returned, by most accounts, with something that had been harder to find in him during the Black Temple years, a degree of willingness to work within something larger than himself. To accept a role that was not the central one, to contribute what he specifically could contribute without requiring that the people around him understand or acknowledge the full weight of what that contribution cost. Whether this represented a genuine change or simply an adjustment to circumstances is not a question the story answers directly. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. What mattered practically was that he returned in a form that could work alongside the people who had killed him and carry forward the plan he had developed in the Nether. The plan was the important thing. The years in the Nether had produced something that all the previous years of Illidan's life had been building toward without quite achieving, a clear and specific understanding of how to take the fight to Argus itself. Previous defenses of Azeroth had shared the same fundamental limitation. They were reactive. They waited for the Legion to arrive and then attempted to push it back, winning tactical victories that did not prevent the Legion from regrouping. As long as the Legion's infrastructure on Argus remained intact, the assaults on Azeroth would continue indefinitely, each one drawing on resources the physical world's defenders could not match across an infinite timeline. Getting to Argus was not one strategic option among others. It was the only approach that addressed the actual problem rather than its symptoms. Illidan understood this. He had spent years in the place where that understanding was most directly available, and he came back with it, ready to use it, in the fight that had always been the reason for everything else. The reunion between Illidan and the people who had killed him was not a comfortable one. The discomfort was not merely personal. It was structural, built into the situation by the full weight of everything that had happened at the Black Temple and in the years before it. The demon hunters who had been imprisoned by the Alliance and Horde were released because the Legion's assault made their capabilities necessary. That is a kind of vindication, but it is the kind that arrives too late and in too conditional a form to feel entirely like one. They were not being welcomed. They were being deployed. The distinction mattered to them even as they accepted the terms. Illidan himself returned to a world that had built a significant body of narrative about him in his absence. Most of that narrative had been produced by people who had been his opponents, and it had the character that such narratives tend to have, accurate in its particulars, incomplete in its context, shaped by the purposes of the people who had constructed and maintained it. He did not arrive as a rehabilitated figure whose reputation had been reconsidered in light of new information. He arrived as the same person he had always been, carrying the same history, the same transformation, the same permanent marks of the choices he had made. The people who encountered him had to work with who he actually was rather than with either the monster of the institutional narrative or the hero of the retrospective reassessment that the situation was in the process of producing. What he brought that was genuinely new was the plan. The years in the twisting Nether had produced a clear and specific understanding of how to reach Argus itself, to strike at the Legion's home base rather than continuing the essentially defensive strategy of repelling invasions at Azeroth's shores. Every previous defense had shared the same fundamental limitation: reactive, waiting for the Legion to arrive and then attempting to push it back. The Legion's infrastructure on Argus made that approach unsustainable across any long timeline. Illidan had spent years in the space where the Legion organized itself, and he had come back with the piece of understanding that made a different approach possible. The reception of this plan was not enthusiastic. Accepting it required accepting that Illidan had spent his years of death doing something useful, which required accepting a version of him that the institutional narrative had not prepared anyone for. The acceptance was functional rather than warm. The campaign toward Argus proceeded on those terms. Argus was the original homeworld of the Draenei, a world of extraordinary beauty and arcane sophistication that the Draenei had inhabited for millennia before the Burning Legion corrupted the Eridar and transformed it from a place of life and learning into the Legion's primary staging ground. The transformation had not been quick. Sargeras had made an offer to Archimonde and Kil'jaeden, the most powerful of the Eridar, who had delivered their world and their people to the Legion's service in exchange for power and purpose. The Draenei who refused, led by Velen, the prophet whose long sight had shown him what the offer actually meant, fled Argus on a dimensional ship, beginning the long exile that would eventually bring them to Draenor, and from there to Azeroth. The Argus they left behind was consumed over the millennia that followed, its surface transformed into the infrastructure of galactic destruction. By the time Azeroth's forces arrived, Argus was almost unrecognizable as what it had been. The sky was permanently green with fel energy. The surface was covered by the Legion's machinery, the portals, the forges, the organizational architecture of a force that had been consuming worlds for an incomprehensible span of time. The Draenei who had survived their exile found the place deeply disorienting, not because it was unfamiliar, but because the familiarity was wrong. The bones of a world they had loved, visible beneath the architecture of what had been done to it. The specific grief of recognizing something and finding it unreachable. The Army of the Light. The force that Illidan and Azeroth's heroes joined on Argus was composed of beings from across the universe who had been fighting the Burning Legion for spans of time that made the Third War look recent. They had been recruited from the worlds the Legion had consumed, sustained by the Naru's power and by the conviction that the fight was winnable. They had the depth of experience that Azeroth's defenders, relative newcomers to the cosmic scale of the conflict, were still developing. The reunion with this force brought its own complications, most notably in the figure of Xe'ra, the Naru who had been involved in the prophecies about Illidan, and who had a specific vision for his role in the war's final act. Xe'ra believed Illidan was the child of light and shadow, the figure whose specific combination of qualities was necessary for what was coming. Her vision was not wrong in the sense that his capabilities were indeed relevant, but the vision required him to accept a transformation, to allow the Naru's light to reshape him in ways that would have fundamentally altered what he was. He refused. He had spent his entire life being defined by other Peopleaid's understandings of what he was for, imprisoned by his brother's judgment, hunted by his warden's obsession, killed by heroes who had accepted a narrative about him that was not entirely wrong and not entirely complete. The Naru's prophecy was, in its structure, another version of this, someone else's vision of what he should be, imposed on him without his consent. When Xe'ra attempted to force the transformation, he destroyed her. The people around him received this with the full range of reactions that such an act tends to produce, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was the surrender of the self he had maintained across everything the story had put him through. He went to Argus on his own terms, carrying his own purpose, which was not the Naru's purpose, and not Azeroth's institutional interests, and not exactly what any single ally needed from him, but which was the distillation of everything his long life had been oriented toward. The final direct engagement with the source of the thing he had been fighting since before most of the people fighting alongside him had been born. The final battle on Argus was the largest engagement in the history of the war against the Burning Legion. Conducted on the Legion's own ground, against its most deeply entrenched defenses, with stakes that went beyond the survival of any single world. Sargeras himself was present, his influence felt throughout the engagement in ways that shaped the battlefield and the decisions of everyone on it. At the center of the final act was the world soul of Argus itself, the planetary consciousness that the Legion had been feeding upon for 10,000 years, transformed by that feeding into something enormous and tortured and dangerous in ways that were distinct from the Legion's external threat. Illidan's role in the final confrontation was the specific role that everything in his life had prepared him for. The world soul of Argus, corrupted beyond recovery, could not be addressed through the conventional means available to the assembled forces. It was too large, too deeply integrated with the demonic energy that had consumed it. What it required was something that could meet it in the space between the physical and the demonic, that could operate at the register of cosmic power while retaining the specific purpose and direction that the Legion's own forces lacked. What it required was exactly what Illidan had made himself into. The combination of arcane mastery and demonic power and the disciplined purpose that held them together applied to the largest possible version of the problem he had been training his whole life to address. The engagement required everything he had. The full depth of the power he had accumulated across the centuries, the complete application of the discipline he had developed, and the willingness to pay whatever cost the moment required, the quality that had characterized his most consequential choices throughout his life, expressed now at a scale that made everything before it look like preparation. He chose to remain, not because he was forced to, not because no other option was available, but because the wound at Argus, even after the battle, was not something that would close on its own. It required active maintenance, the sustained application of purpose that an immortal being of sufficient power could provide, and that a conventional force could not leave behind. He understood this and made the choice that understanding required. The same thing he had done throughout his life, identified what the situation needed, assessed whether he was capable of providing it, and proceeded on that basis without extended negotiation about the personal cost. What the story of Illidan Stormrage illuminates most clearly is the particular difficulty of people who are right about things that others cannot yet see. Being right early about something important does not protect you from the consequences of how you pursue that rightness. It does not exempt you from accountability for the harm caused along the way. The Blood Elves who served him were deepened in their dependency on fell energy, partly because of the arrangements he made available to them. Akama's people were held in subjugation because the subjugation served his operational needs. The demon hunters he trained were sent into a world that treated them as monsters, in large part because the person who had trained them died and left them without the standing that his continued presence might have provided. These were real costs, paid by real people. The fact that his broader purpose was genuine and important does not remove them from the ledger. He was also not the villain that the institutional narrative made him. He was right about the Legion when it mattered. He fought when fighting was costly and continued fighting when it would have been easier to stop. He built something in Outland that was imperfect and coercive and also genuinely pointed at the thing that needed to be pointed at. He spent years, fighting in the only arena still available to him, and returned with the peace of understanding that made the final act possible. He ended where he ended, not fleeing, not negotiating for better terms, not compromising on what the moment required, paying the cost it required, in the manner that had characterized his best moments across the full length of the story. The people who walked away from Argus carried different versions of what had happened there. Some carried a version in which Illidan had been redeemed, in which the full arc of the story added up to something that could be described as a life well spent, despite its costs. Others carried a version in which he had simply finally done the thing his capabilities had always pointed toward, and that the complicated path between his beginning and his ending was a cautionary account about the cost of certainty and the consequences of methods that cannot be fully separated from their purposes. Both versions contain truth. Neither of them contains all of it. The story of Illidan Stormrage spans 10,000 years of Azeroth's history. It begins at the height of a civilization that no longer exists and ends at the farthest edge of the world that civilization's survivors eventually built. Not in triumph exactly, not in defeat either, but in the specific position of a person who has finally done the thing their entire life was organized around, and who remains in that position, maintaining it, in the silence that follows the conclusion of very long and very costly and genuinely important work. The night elf forests of Kalimdor are still standing. The well of eternity has been gone for 10,000 years, replaced by the maelstrom that marks where it used to be. The Black Temple stands in Outland, emptied of the purpose it served, beginning the slow process of becoming something else. And somewhere beyond where the physical world can easily reach, in the wound that Argus became and that Illidan stayed to hold, the work continues in the manner of most work that actually matters. Quietly, without audience. In the long patience of something that does not require recognition to be real. Thank you all for spending this time with one of the longest and most complicated stories that Warcraft has to tell. If you made it to the end, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more lore. Rest well, my friends.